Thank you, Celia. That was great. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you all for coming out so early. Coffee is a nice incentive, but it's been raining out, and it's been treacherous, I've heard. I've just got back into town very recently, so I'm reacclimating myself to Portland and its weather. But I want to thank everybody for coming out, and we really appreciate it. And I'm just so happy that people are very interested in what we might have to say.
Yeah.
I'll let Marge kind of talk about what brushfire is very briefly. I know we don't have a whole lot of time to talk about time, but I think it's important to contextualize the work that we do first.
Okay, can you guys hear me? This is so intimidating holding this. I want one of those microphones I don't have to worry about. So brushfire. So we're brushfire, right? And we created this because something was missing, especially here in the city. There was a gap, and we wanted to fill that gap. And there was like a table, right, that we weren't invited to sit at necessarily. Maybe every once in a while, someone like us, you know, a Black person, was invited to sit there. And so we were like, we want to create something of our own. We wanted to stand in that gap, so we did. We carved out space for ourselves, and we wanted to support people like us. We wanted to make people more visible in the city that got overlooked, and we wanted to create and collaborate. I feel like there were so many people that we didn't know about or hear about because they didn't have a platform for themselves, for their voices, and we wanted to become that platform. I think that when we met, we were so frustrated, and we were like, where do we fit in? And then we realized there was no point waiting for that to happen. Why don't we just make that happen? And so we came up with this idea to have a creative agency. And so it gave us the space to be able to collaborate and reach out to people and to create, which is really all we wanted to do.
So I think that all of what Marge said is true. But these are kind of like,
Thank you.
these are kind of the principles. They're just kind of the three underlying ideals behind what brushfire is. The first part is this idea of history in the past. I think it's important, as we talk about time, that we recognize for various different reasons elements of our history, elements of not just our personal history or social history, but the history of creation, of making things, of bringing things into being. And then at that point, after we can do that, it's important to us to create structures that will allow for the ongoing creation, networks, and connections between people to continue to facilitate that history. And then solidify those things, make those networks solid so that we can continue to create authentically into the future. And those are kind of the underlying ideas. And a lot of this stuff involves collaboration, communication, and creation, all those ION words. And I think the first thing that we did, the first project, I think the project that we're known most for, was this short film that we made. And it was about the future. And it was about the future because at Brushfire, I think our focus is less on the near future, but on what we all hope that a future could be. And by that, it is the best option. It is the best case scenario. It is building now what we can have in the future. We got a lot of comments about Future Portland because I think people confused what it was. It was an example of the three things that we mentioned before. But the whole point of it was to suggest that we have a future. And this is where we begin to think about time in this particular context. Creation is a very interesting idea, and I think that it spans so many different disciplines. I'm not a mathematician. I wish that I were sometimes. I don't know physics as well as I think that I should. All I know is that I create. But the moment of creation is a point in time. And if we define time, we look at it as a point that is now and into the future and the time between when things occur. I think I looked up a lot of definitions of it, and there really isn't a solid definition of time. We have an understanding of it because it exists, because we feel that it is here. But the point is, as creative people, as you all know, when we create something, it is a beginning. It is a point in time. It is a point in time where, as creative people, we are bringing ourselves, the thoughts, the ideas, the experiences, the artwork that we create is making something out of nothing. Maybe nothing. There is a saying that there is nothing new under the sun. I think there's a biblical quote. And you can associate that with physics. You can associate that with so many different principles of temporal time, of creation, of atoms and molecules. The idea that something that we create and bring into being, everything that we create has already existed. There are so many different theories that suggest that. But at this point, what I think is most important about that idea is that we are creating something that exists, that is from us, that is part of our hearts, that is a combination of what is in here and what is in here. I think that is the most important element, that we are creating, in a sense, ourselves. We are physical. We are making a physical representation. Most times it is physical. These days there are digital formats that may not take on physical form. I was talking earlier about web design and creating digital expression and designing websites and coding. Those are all, in a sense, not in a sense, very much art forms, I believe. So when we create, and I work mostly in film and storytelling. And storytelling is very interesting because I believe it is very inspiring. And it is inspiring in the sense that it allows us to transcend time. When we create ideas, when we create concepts, and we tell stories about the future or about the past, but particularly about the future, we inspire large populations of people to think differently about how things work. In Philadelphia, I'm working to create not a documentary, but I follow different people, and one of the people that I'm following and making a short story about is a person who's a scientist who is creating graphene. I'm not sure if you guys know what graphene is, but it's amazing. It's like a two-dimensional object. It's like you can only see it in 2 dimensions, and if you turn it on its side, it disappears, it's gone. It's 1 atom thick. It is a carbon lattice structure that exists in only 2 dimensions. But what it does is, and it still kind of blows my mind in a certain way, but it enables so much from a creative standpoint. And one of the things that, I know a lot of people last night went to see the Star Wars movie. Great. I'm a big fan of Star Trek. But Star Trek does something interesting because it is a creative endeavor, right? It is a creative idea. Someone, Gene Roddenberry, created this world, this universe of creative things. And then here we have in the real world a scientist working with this substance called graphene. And what she told me struck me. She told me that she was using graphene, and she's trying to mass produce graphene in a way that can make it available for other people to use, scientists to make these wonderful, magical things. And the thing that she was working on in particular was something called a biosensor. And what graphene will enable our society to do today is identify within a patient or an individual, someone who is sick. It can identify the problem or someone's physical ailments. And I'm not sure how it does it. It's magic. I don't know how it works. But essentially what this person is creating, and I'm going to get a little nerdy here, is a tricorder. I am not, can I say, I can say shit. I am not shitting you. She told me, and she wasn't a Star Trek fan. She was very, very much an analytical person. She didn't have anything to do. She didn't with anything creative necessarily, although she was creating. But she described what it did, and she said, you know what? What we'll be able to do with this device is if an ambulance goes out and first responders show up to the scene, They can identify the problem with someone by scanning them and taking a very simple sample of their blood and instantly getting a readout of what's wrong with him or what could be wrong with him. And this graphene somehow enables them to do it in like 30 seconds. And I said, and of course I'm sitting there like, okay, I don't know what this means. I'm like, whoa, Star Trek, Star Trek, Star Trek. Oh my God, this reality is happening. But the point is, Star Trek was created in the 60s. In the 60s. How is it possible that someone in the 60s identified a technology that was created, that still hasn't been created yet in real life? IRL. But it happened. It happened, right? This is happening. Graphene is a thing. Tricores are a thing, along with a number of other different things that we've created in our minds as individuals. I find that fascinating. But it is, in a sense, it's almost like time travel in a weird way. So we already know what happens to us. As a filmmaker, as someone who loves cinema and storytelling, we know what the future is like. We have a sense of it. And because we have a sense of what happens in the future, that's why we started Brushfire. Because we're kind of in the middle of a really interesting time. And I start a lot of my conversations with that very thing. We live in a very interesting time. And I say interesting because it's a safe word to use. So there are several directions that we could go in. Margaret and I saw the direction that we could go in, and we saw that this particular community, Portland, as a representative of other communities in the United States, we were concerned. And we were concerned because we felt that there were certain incongruities with representation, with who was creating what. Things were being confused. The creative world is in this condition where there's a lack of connection between who creates, who's allowed to create, why we create, and as a community, how we use, and as a society, how we use what we create and monetize it and sell it and trade it. This whole creative landscape was going at a pace that we felt was outstripping some of the essential foundations of what creation actually is. So one thing that's important, well, let me give you an example. One of the examples that we came up with to kind of describe this phenomenon, this incongruity, is with music. I love music. There are very few people in the world who would say I don't like music, right? I mean, maybe there are some people who don't like music. But the fact about music, and when I talked about creation earlier, the thing about music is it's unique in the art forms in the sense that it is one of the only art forms that does not require any supplementary power to distribute it. For example, like we're here in the art museum and there are several paintings and there are several sculptures and physical objects that represent someone else's art, someone else's creation, something that came from someone else. It is a physical thing that exists here and that you have to make an attempt to see it here, in this place. You can see representations of it on the internet. You can get prints and posters, and I'm sure the museum would love you to buy prints and posters. You can see it on the internet, but music goes to you, and oftentimes whether you like it or not. You can walk around the street, people will play music, they'll be busking, and you'll hear it consciously or not. It does not require any external power to push it forward. I'm not a musician. Are there any musicians here? Great, you guys are amazing people. I don't understand how you do it. But I appreciate the work that you guys do. And because of this, I want to use music as this example because of these things, but also because music comes from an internal voice. And I think it is very connected to this idea that your soul is in it. Let mean, your soul is in every piece of art. As an artist, as a creative person, you put yourself into it. But music, I think, like I said before, exists under its own power. It travels on the air. It comes from your voice and reverberates. And like I said, your antennas pick it up whether you like it or not. But that's also, in this day and age, something that might be a problem. So I'll give you an example of, so I guess the point of that is to say that the difference between music is that it is not stationary, in that the physical artwork, the paintings, the sculpture, the other wonderful things that make this world great are. And being in that presence creates context, right? That's what museums are. They're contextual places where you come and understand, and you can interpret, and you can sometimes feel and see and recognize the detail. You are there, and you are present in this place. With music, it does not require that. The place where music is created is its context. It is its original context, either where it's recorded or where it's played on the street. There is less of an opportunity of a displacement between intent, emotion, and communication and how it is received. I have an example. I'm from Portland, I was born here, but my parents, who were born in the South, both of them Mississippi and Louisiana, they moved to Southern California and lived in Compton. Compton, California is a wonderful place. In the 80s, we used to travel up and down I-5. And it was a long ride for me. It's like 18 hours in a station wagon. It was a red Volvo station wagon. My brother, my sister, and myself, my mother and father would trade driving, and we would yell and scream, and are we there yet? But when we traveled from Portland to Southern California, something very unique happened. And I would be so excited every time I went to California, not because I would see my family, not because I would see my cousins and go to Six Flags and all the stuff that we didn't have up here. But what I was most excited about, and I don't think I understood it at the time, but what excited me is that I would be in this different context. In this context of Southern California was different in so many different ways. One of the things I really loved was the music of that era, of that time. And what I would do is I would buy cassette tapes. I would buy these cassette tapes before we would go down there. And I would have like these 8-packs, and I was like, I'd start to label them. And what I would do is I would go to my grandparents' house, and I would stick them in this tape player. Is that what they call them? Tape players. And I would tune on the radio, and I would wait. And I would wait till my favorite songs came on, or songs I didn't recognize. But they were about, and a lot of it was like early rap. It wasn't hip-hop yet. People like, Big Daddy Kane and Kool Moe Dee and Kwame and Too Short was in Oakland. But all those people who had no idea what was going on here in Portland. Just no one knew about any of those people, but I would wait. And my cousins would come over and we would dance and we would have fun, and I would hear the slang and I would hear all these different really important elements of someone else's creation I was capturing. And the most exciting thing was when we took the drive up at the end of the summer, was coming back to Portland and sharing all that with my friends here. And that's a very important story. It's a very important story because what I am doing is I am taking a very, very particular emotional context and changing it and sharing it with other people. Now, creation is interesting because as artists, we have studios, right? We have laboratories, we have places where we create. And those places that we create and make and invent, those places are sacred for a lot of reasons. And when you look at laboratories, and this example I was talking about graphene, a lot of that stuff is secret, right? They don't want this stuff to get out before it's too soon. For a lot of reasons, because people don't want to lose their intellectual property, or they don't want to, risk, having someone spy on them and taking their idea. Those are very important concepts. But I think one of the more important elements of that is the fact that in science in particular, those ideas are held onto and guarded, not just to safeguard potential financial gain, but to safeguard mistakes, to correct against the possibility that somehow that work is misrepresented. And that somehow, because it could possibly pose a danger. What if we're not researching graphene correctly? What if these biosensors end up killing people instead? We keep and hold on to those ideas because we don't want to damage, potentially cause harm or damage to someone in a scientific kind of setting. So we hold on to it and we guard it until it's ready, and then we release it to the world. We do that very similarly with our artwork as well. We hold on to it. We create it in a place, and that place is sacred, and we allow it to slowly unfold. We allow it to slowly proliferate throughout society in a way that is perhaps comfortable. And a lot of artists say that their work is never done, and that's true. But after it's created, we have the ability to control or at least guide the context through which it proliferates to society. Sometimes we don't, and some people might disagree with that. Some people say that art is art, you create it and you let it go and it does what it does. And I think that's true. But for the most part, I think as artists and as people who are of their own craft, we want to, and because we are representing ourselves, we want to make sure that it is our true selves. And that it represents us correctly. In the marketplace, or just creatively, we want it to be the best possible version of ourselves, so to speak. So what happens when I move from Southern California back to Portland is that I'm changing that context. I'm doing something different. But it happens at the speed of a car traveling from Southern California to Portland, Oregon. And back then it was probably 55 miles an hour. My dad probably was a little liberal with that. But the point is, what is important is that my world, my family, and the art that I received, and the emotion that I received from the music, from the dance, from the art, from the slang, from the language, all that stuff was really important, and I enjoyed sharing it. And in sharing it, I don't change the meaning, but when I share it with someone else, what I do is I create my own kind of way of sharing it, and I deliver it to someone else, and then all of a sudden, slowly my friends are using the same slang. Oh, that's tight. Oh, that's cool. That's fresh. That's dope. Like all those different things move, and all of a sudden we have a different way of interacting. It changes us. I find that fascinating. I find it fascinating because it happens very slowly. It happened very slowly. This is a map, somewhat haphazard. But I want to use the example of this radio station because radio stations back in the day weren't like what we have today, right? We don't have, I'm not sure how many people listen to the radio, but for music at least. I know some people listen to public radio, people listen to podcasts. We have a different way of communicating. But this is kind of generally how those maps laid out back in the day. You had upper East Coast stations, you had around the belt around the South, you have the Northwest and all that kind of thing. And those stations only have a certain broadcast radius. They don't broadcast everywhere. Back in the day, we didn't have these large networks. We had syndication and all those kind of things, but it was a different structure. But what radio did and what this network did, for music in particular, was create these pockets of creativity. These places represent very important groups of experience across the United States. Various, beautiful, wonderful, amazing experiences of a lot of different people. Tragic, scary, dangerous, so many different things are represented by these regions. And they're very random regions, trust me. I don't represent anything in particular that actually relates to where radio stations were. But that's just kind of made sense to me. So what I was doing in my car was what radio stations did more efficiently, in a way, kind of. Actually, I should probably say the opposite. Back then, the way radio stations work is you paid to play, right? Everyone knows about payola. Everyone knows how that worked. You had to get your artists who represent music, who represent art and experience. All that stuff is in broadcast. And it's broadcast in a way that allows for a certain area to experience a certain kind of music. Here in the South, in this region here, you have blues and soul music and R&B developing and gospel. All those things happen down here, and then they slowly move. But the only way to do that was to either, the only way to move your experience from one place to another was either to get stations out here to agree to play it, or you were on the road. You were traveling. You were on the road, moving your cultural experience, moving your heart and soul, and trying to get as many people as possible to listen to it because you wanted to share it. Today, we're moving a little bit too quickly. Today, we don't rely on these kinds of systems. And there are iterations that I can't quite pinpoint, and I would love for people to help me do this. But I believe very strongly that the pace of which we are creating and distributing is widely out of sync. That we are creating at a pace that is our own, but we are distributing at a pace that far exceeds creation. And if we create too quickly, if we create at a pace that is our own, if we increase the pace that we distribute that content, that it gets out there, that difference in pace, that incongruity, I think begins to create problems for us. And I'm not sure how these problems manifest, but I think it has something to do with the decontextualization of our creation and of our work, and the interpretation of that by other people, and the potential to make errors with what that means. And when we make errors, when we misinterpret someone's idea, we're misinterpreting them, if we're talking about art. We're really misinterpreting people and feelings and ideas at the very least. So all these ideas are based on a hypothesis of distribution, of speed, of pace, of rate, and a ratio between what we create and how fast we share it. Just like the laboratory. We have to decide, we have to figure out what is an appropriate amount of time that an idea needs to gestate. You all know, everyone as artists know, that there is a period of time where you sit in your laboratory, you sit in your studio, and you figure out things. You look for inspiration, you allow it to cultivate, you figure out what it means to you and to yourself, you share it with a few people, maybe your colleagues, your co-workers, your co-collaborators, and you allow ideas to slowly proliferate. These days, with music in particular, you don't listen to the radio, you may not even listen to artists. You may just throw on Spotify or Pandora, and you allow someone else to decide what it is that you're listening to. You don't listen to music anymore, you listen to Pandora. I listen to Spotify. And when you listen to Spotify, you have no idea. Sometimes you have no idea who the person is you're listening to, but you like it. You may have heard it a little bit before, but what you're doing is you're disconnecting someone's meaning with your own. You don't understand exactly what the connection may or may not be, but you like the way it feels, and that's great. But the fact of the matter is, we are losing touch with meaning. And we're losing touch with meaning because we have a really strong desire and a need to distribute and share. That's what the internet's all about, right? We share. We see the little arrow, we click, we share. We see the little tweet, we click, we share. And I think that's great. But when we do that, and what happens so often, especially on the internet, is what do? We misunderstand. We don't quite get what someone means because we're not talking face to face. You're not watching me as I paint. You're not watching me as I sculpt. You're not watching me or hearing me as I develop my music. And I don't expect that every fan of music or art should be present when someone's creating art. That's not what I mean. I mean, ideally, maybe that would be good. I'm not sure. In order to maintain that connection between creation and interpretation and feeling. But I think there's something there. But what we've done is, and this is why I would love your help on this hypothesis, and whoever has the inclination or the wherewithal to support and help me with understand this, I would love to try to figure out how to quantify these ideas, how to make some of these things more real, in a sense. But the idea is that. Let me back that up. What I want to say is that over time, we are hurtling forward at a pace that is very, very, very fast. And it's like Moore's law in a certain sense. Moore's law is this idea that we can create processors and computers will increase in their efficiency and speed over a certain amount of time. I think the same thing is happening between this dissonance between creativity, inception, and then distribution. And I'd like to come up with some kind of mathematical formula to represent that. I'd love some help with that. But the idea that we are all, the internet as a thing, the internet's been around for a long time. It's been around in ourselves, as traveling musicians, as artists, as people taking the oral tradition and moving from one place to another, sharing stories with cousins and family, and then with family, with friends, and with friends with the world. The idea is that there are these mechanisms that exist inherent in society that are designed to proliferate and share. And I believe in sharing. I think sharing is good, although when I was a kid I didn't like it, and still sharing kind of sucks every once in a while. But the fact of the matter is that we are moving inherently towards this place that is a conglomerate, it is a collaborative experience. It is a marketplace of ideas that comes from all of us as creative people. But we have this danger, and I think that inevitably we are going to travel to this place where eventually all ideas are fair. Like everything is fair game, right? Everything is out there for us to use, everything is out there for us to integrate. That should be the world that we live in, but it's not. And it's not because I feel like there's this incongruity between creation and distribution. But our internets are happening, and they're happening quickly. I think they're happening at a rate that is exponential. If someone wants to help me try and chart that and figure out the factors that are involved in engaging that, I would love it. So there's this imperative, right? There's this imperative to try to figure out, from my perspective, how to figure out how to keep this at a certain balance. How to make sure that we are not out of proportion. How do we strip that back? How do we slow that down? How do we keep them more in a better proportion? I don't know how to do that. I have ideas. That's part of what Brushfire is about. It's about reestablishing that connection between creation and sharing and collaboration, which is eventually that place that we all want to go to. The danger of misrepresenting people is a lot more perilous than we might imagine. And I think that every year, every invention, every creation that we come up with further damages that. And I mean, I have an example. There's an example of, everyone knows of these examples where idea is created and all of a sudden, it shows up somewhere else in someone else's work. And immediately we say, oh, that's stealing. Someone stolen my idea. Well, what do you expect? You're throwing it out there. And in the best case scenario, you wouldn't worry about royalties. You wouldn't worry about how much you're going to get from that, or who owns this, or who gets the attribution. I think those are all very important things, but in this perfect world where everything is being created and we're not concerned with those things, it should be okay. We should be able to take and grab and collage and make things. And we can do that. And there are certain allowances within our laws and our copyright laws that allow for a certain amount of that. But the structures aren't sufficient. So I think everyone might have known this example, right? The example of Wild. This guy named Sam Larson. He's a local. I think he's from the Northwest. I'm not sure. Maybe he's from Portland. I think he is. Is that right? Does anyone know? Does everyone know this story? Remember it? No? Marge, why don't you tell them about this story?
I was really into all of this. So we were talking about the idea of putting our work out there and talking about how people can just take now, with the creation of Pinterest and blogs that kind of glean things for you. And there weren't really any rules set up when that stuff kind of came out, and artists started to see bigger groups and corporations kind of reproducing their work, not even changing it that much, right? Literally the same thing, and then adding some lines. And thinking that wouldn't get around and no one would notice. And they're profiting off of it.
Forever 21.
Yeah. And it sold out. They made a lot of money off of it.
A lot.
And that is, we could talk about appropriation. but we won't go there. But I think that with the internet, it's kind of accelerated us at a way faster pace than what we were prepared for. And putting our work out there, we're kind of taking this chance and hoping that people will recognize, right, and give us our credit. There are people who also will be inspired by what we're doing and do this and call that inspiration and call that, oh, we're collaborating, or we saw this idea, now we're creating this. But that's not really creating anything new. That's not encouraging collaboration. And the internet has kind of taken this place of stepping in between the collaborating, where anything you want to make or anything you want to look up, you can just Google it and find it, and you can recreate it.
So Sam Larson, there was this whole big hubbubaloo. But the point is, you can look at this situation and you can say someone is maliciously stealing my idea. And their intent was to steal. But there's also a different way of looking at it. And I'm not sure, I'm not here validating any particular outcome that's related to this. I don't know what happened. I don't know what the outcome was with respect to this particular person's work and the appropriation of it. But the idea is that someone was obviously inspired in one way or another, right? I mean, this was inspiration. And I'm sure that's an argument that many people use. But how, and it is possible that someone was innocently appropriating work. Because in this ideal world, there should be nothing wrong with this, right? Unless we are able, I mean, as long as we are able to associate, attribute what it is that we're working with to someone else's work, how we were inspired. These kind of things happen, and they happen all the time, whether or not they are intentional or whether or not they are subconscious, just like with the music example. There are several examples in music in particular. I can think of Robin Thicke and Marvin Gaye. It's a very famous situation. And there's this, I was going to say there's this blurred line. But there is this line between inspiration and stealing or appreciation. We always hear that. We always understand that. But I think what happens when we are moving so quickly and we are sharing, it will inadvertently happen. And it is part of the process of a group of human beings on this planet growing together. It is part of that process. The problem, we have not facilitated the structures that are able to support it. It is a natural evolution of our society, and it will actually facilitate a way for us as human beings to coexist. It is a mechanism. But we're not ready for that yet. I don't believe we are, obviously because of situations like this, and people have fought wars over less. And so we know what the future looks like. We know where we're going. How do we stop it? How do we work with it? How do we create systems that will help us to understand, that will help us to appreciate, but I think understand is probably more important, the meaning and the intention and the art and the heart and the feeling and the thoughts and the ideas. And this is not just with art and creativity, it's with everything. Just like with the graphene, it all ties in. So in that sense, we have an opportunity to change the future because we know what it looks, we know what the future looks like, especially in films. We have lots of science fiction films describing what our society looks like in the future, and sometimes it's very bleak. But those are creative ideas that are associated with feeling and ideas and concepts that are based in now. But with creativity, we have the ability to make predictions. We have the ability to create our own future. And I hate to sound sort of cliche, but that is the reality of what we're working with today. We have to make concerted attempts to create authentic connection to not only our art, but to ourselves. And I think that's probably one of the more important things and the important ideas that I've wanted to share with you. But this is all a hypothesis. I don't know if this is right. It's just a feeling that we're moving a little bit too quickly. We're sharing a little bit too fast. We're not taking our time to understand the experiences of people, which is associated and connected with creation and the art that comes from us. I talk a lot, I'm sorry. There's a quote that I have that I actually don't know I know exactly where it came from. It came from Star Trek. But I was a little bit, I didn't want to go too nerdy, but I thought I would end with this idea that James Kirk said this. I think it was like 2439 or something like that. But there's this idea that looking into the future means we forget about the past, or that means we let go of it. I don't think that's exactly the right thing to do. I think that obviously history and future are definitely connected. And that is our goal, is to, as a company, is to establish, like we said in the beginning, authentic mechanisms that help associate and connect ideas with human beings. I think that's the fundamental element of what we do at Brushfire. Thank you.